Hello, seventh graders. This is going to start lesson 24, which will be our last lesson. We are finishing the book today, and everything else that you'll be seeing from me will probably be on paper. You'll need to clearly read those directions. So as we wrap up, we have 2 questions left to answer today. And yesterday we finished up right on 7, how did Jethro feel about Lincoln's death? And there was quite a bit of information within there. And then we're going to pick up with questions 8 and 9, who was the gaunt soldier who found Jethro in the field? And 9, what was Shad's plan for Jethro? I take that back. We are going to cover number 7, how did Jethro feel about Lincoln's death, in this lesson as well. I'm adding this introduction after I've actually recorded this. I'm kind of piecing some things together because we had some interruptions yesterday. So hopefully it flows pretty smoothly for you and you have those few questions left to finish. All right, let's continue at the bottom of page 183. The work of the farm had to go on. Ellen had washed and scrubbed and cooked for her family the summer her 3 children had died. And in the spring of '65, Jethro went back to the fields and plowed the same furrows he had plowed for the past 4 years. But there was no longer any beauty in the world about him or any serenity in his heart. Sometimes he cried as the closing lines of his letter from the president flashed into his mind. May God bless you for your earnest effort to seek out the right. May he guide both you and me in that search during the days to come. And he remembered Ross Milton's words, my hope lies in Abraham Lincoln. If he can control the bigots, if he can allow the defeated their dignity. Little by little, the story came through, details of the assassination, the attempted murder of the Secretary of State, the nation's wrath and woe. And then the news of a train on its way from the east, a train carrying Abraham Lincoln back to Springfield, Illinois. One thought was with Jethro constantly during those April days as the train bearing the president made its slow journey across the miles towards Springfield. I want to see him. Just once I want to look on his face. Springfield is only 100 miles away, but the 100 miles might just well have been 1,000. The yoke of the farm had settled firmly across Jethro's shoulders. His work in the fields at the proper season was the sole source of food for his parents, for John's family, and for himself. There was no time or opportunity to go to Springfield. No hope of looking upon a face at once the plainest and most beautiful, the humblest and the most magnificent that Jethro would know in his lifetime. It was the saddest and most cruel April of the 5. It had held out in almost unbelievable joy and had then struck out in fury at those whose hands were outstretched. Jethro had learned to accept the whims of fate, schooled as he was in the philosophy of men who work the soil. The rains came or they were withheld. The heat ripened the grain or it blasted it with a scorching flame. The ears of corn matured in golden beauty, or they were infested by worms or blight. One accepted the good or the evil with humility, for life was a mystery, and questions were not for the lowly. But on that last Sunday of that April, a Sunday of sunlight and bright sky, Jethro lay in the grass on Walnut Hill, and rage mingled with grief in his heart. Why did it happen? Why did it have to happen? He lay with his face close to the earth, clutching the fresh spring grass with both hands. Never before has a president been killed. They've been looked after, watched over, and now this one, the one that has carried the load of this war till he's old and tired, the one that was my friend. He tried for a while to believe that the agony inside him was part of one of the nightmares that had recurred so often ever since the early stories of Wilson's Creek. But the warm April breeze stirred his hair, and the smell of the earth and the cry of the birds in the trees above him were a part of reality. This was no dream. Abraham Lincoln had been senselessly slain by the hand of a madman, and Jethro Crichton, with all the people of his time, had suffered an irreparable loss. So how does Jethro feel about Lincoln's death? He is absolutely distraught. He is grieving over this death. He feels that he knew him, although he never met him. He received a letter back from him. He was from his own home state. He really looked up to him. He wished to be able to shake this man's hand someday. When he heard about the train, he wanted to go. He wanted to travel the 100 miles to Springfield to be able to just see the train passing that his body was on. And that was a real thing. Thousands of people would just go up and watch the train go by. They didn't get to see Lincoln. They didn't get to see the coffin, but they would go to where the train was passing and know that the president had been on, that his body was on that train, and would go to see it. That's what Jethro wanted to do as well, but he can't. The farm, everything on it is up to him now. If he doesn't work the farm, the food won't be ready for them. He's got to work the fields. He's got to take care of it. He's got to make sure that everything that the family needs is taken care of. So he is very upset and distraught by Lincoln's death. Okay, we're going to pick up halfway down page 185. He heard steps approaching, and a moment later, a hand was laid on his shoulder. He thought it might be Ed Turner or maybe old Israel Thomas, kind and full of sympathy, but of no help to him in this hour. He could not talk, nor did he wish to listen, and so he lay quietly, hoping the intruder would go away and leave him to the pain of this latest and mightiest blow. But the hand was not lifted, and after a long moment, someone spoke. Recognition of the voice drew Jethro up in startled surprise. The man who knelt beside him was thin and gaunt, with a soft, dark beard covering his cheeks. He was a young man, but his eyes were tired, and there were a few strands of gray in his dark hair. Jethro would have passed him on the streets of Newton without recognizing him, but the voice had not changed. It was that of his teacher, his brother now, Shadrach Yale. So there's the answer to question 8, who was the gaunt soldier? It is Shadrach Yale. He had not embraced one of his brothers since the day of his very early childhood, but that morning he put his arms around Shadrach, and slowly the joy for the living assuaged a little the grief for the dead. Shad, it's a day I've dreamed about, he said, and even as he spoke, he vaguely wondered why it was he should whisper the words. Shadrach did not speak at first. He sat looking at Jethro as if he, in turn, doubted the reality of his senses. Finally, he said, Jeth, how you have grown. How much you look like Bill. I can't believe it. They were silent for a long time, each studying the other's face. An onlooker not understanding the situation would have wondered at the strange intensity of the trip, too. An onlooker might have believed for a moment that they were man and boy suddenly bereft of their reason. Jethro finally broke the silence. Jenny? He asked eagerly. Shadrach smiled then. She's up at the house, Jeth, all eagerness to see you. I asked if I might come out and find you first. It has been such a long time. How did you get here, Shad? You didn't let us know. Mr. Milton met us in Olney last night and loaned us his horse and buggy to drive up here today. We wanted to surprise you. We had hoped it would be a perfect homecoming. He paused, and Jethro understood. No perfect pearl. The editor had been right. I wanted so much to see him, Shad. Pa had said that maybe after the war was over, I could go to Washington. Maybe I could shake his hand. Shadrach could only nod. He placed his hand for a second on Jethro's shoulder. Did you see him, Shad? More than the one time you wrote me about, the time he was riding with Grant? We saw him that night, Jeth, the night of the 14th. Jenny and I had gone for a stroll after supper, and as we walked along, we noticed that a little crowd had congregated, and then down the street we saw the president's carriage. There was some cheering, and he looked out at us and smiled. His face looked very old, but it was a happy face that night. I feel sure of that. Shadrach paused as if he were not sure he should say any more, but finally he continued. We were awakened about 11 o'clock by noise and shouting in the street. We could understand only a few words of the shouting, but they were enough to make us dress and hurry outside. There was a soldier standing on the corner. He was crying, but he told us. The distant horizon blurred a little, and the birds' trills and the soft golden blanket of sunlight over the fields and orchards seemed out of place, like laughter in a church. Shadrach was speaking again. I could take you to Springfield, Jeff. Mr. Milton and I talked about it last night. He doubts if it is best. There is no Abraham Lincoln for you to see, you know, only the empty shell. We think it would only hurt you. I reckon you're right. You're going to have to help with the work this summer. Shadrach strove to bring lightness into his voice. I'm sorry, you're going to have help with the work this summer. Jenny is going to help your mother. I'll go out to the fields with you, and John will be here in a few weeks. We saw him just a while before we left Washington. Jethro nodded, while a crowd of thoughts raced through his mind. Will you teach the school again next winter, Shad? Shadrach's eyes lighted at the question. That is something I should let Jenny tell you, Jeff, but I can't. I'm going back to college. My uncle can get me a teaching position while I finish my work, and Jenny and I have decided that you're going with us. You've plowed long enough, Jeff. You're going to study now. Jethro's hand found a sharp stick and he dug it into the earth, twisted it around and stared at the hole he had made as if it had some meaning. It would be the finest thing on earth for me. But what about my folks? My ma has lost 3 little boys, and Mary and Tom and Bill. I'm the youngest. They depend on me. You are their pride, Jeff. Those 2 want the very best for you. And they won't be alone. Eb will be back. And there's always John. He wants you to get an education and then later to help his own boys along the same road. It's going to work out, Jeff. You'll see. Jethro smiled slowly. Don't build me up too much, Shad, he said after a while. Something's like to break inside of me. At that moment, a voice sounded across the field from somewhere near the cabin. Shad, Jeff, you 2 boys better come in now. I'm getting real vexed with both of you. Yes, let's go see Jenny, Jethro said huskily. They walked together across the bridge that spanned Crooked Creek and through the half-acre south of the cabin, where 4 years before Jethro had helped his mother plant potatoes on a day when the news of Sumter had not quite reached the prairies. A little distance up the road, past the hedge of lilacs and under the silver poplars of the dooryard, Jenny stood at the gate, waiting for them. She seemed taller in her city clothes, thinner and more delicate. But she was the same Jenny. Her arms were held out to Jethro, and for that moment when he ran toward her, all the shadows were lifted from the April morning. And that is the end of the book. So the war is over. Unfortunately, it ends on a sad note with Abraham Lincoln being killed, but a good note for Jethro. What was the plan that Shad has for him? First of all, Shad is going to continue his college and his education. He's going to get a job working there while he's there, and they are taking Jethro with him. So Jethro is also going to get an education, and obviously he has a pretty good life. If you remember back to the beginning, I won't read it to you again, but if you remember back when I did the introduction lesson, there is that author's note that tells us about how Jethro was based on our author's grandfather. So we can get a little bit of information from in there. So please make sure that you wrap up your questions for chapter 12. Make sure we get those submitted. And this time it won't be a quiz. We will be moving toward a test. And I will either have some directions probably written down that you'll need to read about how to complete that test, because it will take you probably longer than 20 minutes. And I'll go over how to do that with you and what the expectations are. And I look forward to seeing you soon, I hope. Perhaps September. Have a good day.